Hello and welcome to episode 23 of MMO Weekly, presented as always by MetsMerizedOnline.com. I'm your host, Sal Manzo, joined by my co-host and MMO executive editor, Mike Mayer, and we're joined by a special guest, Mets beat writer for The Athletic, Tim Britton. Tim, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thanks for having me. I told you guys off camera. I'm apologizing for recording from a dungeon in my basement. We just got my son to sleep tonight, and I am not going to risk anything. Michael, you get your son to sleep. You are letting that happen. So I'm down in the basement, in the unfinished part of our basement, hoping that nothing creeps up behind me while we're here.
Yeah, it honestly looks like we might be doing an episode of House of Dragons.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time regardless. We won't try and get too crazy so we don't wake anyone up. But, obviously we have to, I guess, start with kind of the Mets disappointing, finish to the season here in the wild card rounds. Last time I want to talk about it for the off season, but obviously having you here, just kind of want to get your final thoughts from that series. How you feel now going into the off season, just your overall thoughts now.
Yeah, I mean, in a 3-game playoff series, like as we've seen, not just in Queens that weekend, but kind of across baseball, that you need your best players to play well, and that didn't happen for the Mets. Max Scherzer did not have a good start on that Friday night. Chris Bassett didn't have a good one on that Sunday night. The bats were quiet, especially in Sunday night. One hit against Joe Musgrove. It doesn't say. I don't think it says so much about inherent flaws in the team construction or anything like that. We've seen other good teams, like the Dodgers won 111 games and lost 3 out of 4 to the Padres. Trent Grisham was an amazing player for 7 games and then turned back into Trent Grisham. Weird things happen in the playoffs, but that doesn't. I don't want. I think as a Mets fan, you don't want the front office to kind of have this nihilistic attitude about the postseason, like, whatever, like it's a crapshoot. Why bother trying to build an even better team if it's just going to be like this? I think there are certain things you can do to try to make it a more successful team in the postseason, and we'll be interested in seeing how they go about that this offseason.
Yeah, and I think jumping to that too is just the NL has obviously been crazy where the best teams have already lost. But the AL has basically played right out to how you would think it would be. The Astros are the best team in the regular season. They've haven't lost yet in the postseason, and they have a really good chance of beating the Phillies to win another World Series. So I think that kind of goes to the opposite view. You really want to look at what the Astros have done and the fact that they built a really good, they have a really good organization, so they continue to build really good teams. But the Mets kind of have a similar game plan as the Astros with the pitching and the offensive approach. I just think, the Mets kind of just in such a short series, you can't have starters lay an egg. And Scherzer and Bassett have both been great for the Mets the entire season, and it just worked out badly for the Mets that both of them had terrible starts in the same series. That's tough to overcome, and the Mets offense would have really had to put together a couple of good games, and the power just wasn't there, and they weren't able to string hits together either. So it was just kind of bad timing in general for the Mets after what was a bad couple. Well, I mean, it was a bad most of September, really, to lose the games they did to some really bad teams at home, and then the series against the Braves that I don't think we need to talk about too much more.
No, it's interesting. Like, of all the things that I'm sure you guys talked about that I wrote about and talked about on our podcast all season long, kind of like, what are you worried about with the Mets going into September and October? You talk about left-handed reliever. They don't have one. Talk about needing to hit home runs, the offense not being as consistent, talking about the bullpen, talking about catcher production. I don't think anyone said, like, what I'm really worried about is if they have Scherzer, deGrom, and Bassett going in 2 important series on consecutive weekends. I don't know that that's good enough. I think they need to supplement the starting rotation. No one thought that, and yet that was really what undid them down the stretch of the season. And that's kind of what makes it an interesting offseason, is that the things that we thought might be the problem for them weren't necessarily the biggest problem for them at the end of the season. It was actually what had been their strong point throughout the year.
Yeah, no, I totally agree there. And it's funny, thinking about what you're saying as far as, Mike and I talked as far as when the deadline happened, that they didn't get a left-handed reliever, or really, besides, Michael Givens, really a high leverage reliever at all. And we thought that was really going to bite them in the postseason. And same thing as far as adding to the offense. But then, in a short series there, like you said, the strength all year in a weird series like that, the pitching kind of let them down. And ultimately, it just shows why winning the division was so important. wasn't able to get there. But, it's just interesting now as far as with the postseason. Look at a team like the Phillies. They won, 87, 88 games. Mets and the Braves won 202 games between the two of them. And, Phillies in the World Series right now. And it's, skeptical at first as far as for the new postseason format, I guess, with so many teams making it. But I think it is, makes it more exciting as far as when a team like Philly, who can get hot at the right time, they get a guy like Bryce Harper back and look at what he's done now. I think it makes it, much more probably interesting. Stinks, I guess, for teams like the Mets and the Dodgers and the Braves who had such good, regular seasons. But I'm just kind of want to get your thoughts on this expanded postseason now. If, you like it yet, if you liked it from the beginning, just want to get your thoughts there.
I mean, like any person who is a kind of a baseball traditionalist, I don't love the idea of so many teams getting into the postseason. I kind of liked 4. I can go back to 2, per league. But, one thing that did bother me a little bit was like the people jumping to conclusions that the format was the main reason that we had teams losing earlier. And that this is like exclusive to baseball. I understand that baseball in small samples, we play 162 games for a reason, but it's not like there aren't weird things that happen in other sports. Like, the Rams and Bengals played in the Super Bowl last year. Those were a pair of 4 seeds. And no one said like, oh, Cincinnati winning in Tennessee and Kansas City is bad for the NFL. And the NBA playoffs in the last 3 years, 4 number 1 seeds have lost before the conference finals. That's more than has happened in baseball in that time. So it's not, the idea of just, you're going to have randomness when you have playoffs. Like, this isn't the Premier League. And no one wants it to be the Premier League, really. We could put more emphasis on like how good it is to do well in the regular season. That winning 111 games for the Dodgers, or San Francisco winning 107 last year and winning an incredible division race with LA. Let's celebrate that maybe a little bit more than them getting knocked out in kind of a best of 5 coin toss. So I think, I don't love the format, but I no format in baseball is going to give you what you necessarily want, that balance between an exciting postseason and honoring the best teams in the regular season.
Yeah, and I think going back to before, just having a 1-game wild card, I mean, a lot of people complained about that too, because that's even a bigger crapshoot. You could just have like Joe Musgrove could just come out and dominate out of nowhere, and that's the series. So at least the wild card round is now 3 games, but then getting the next series to 5 games. I think I'd rather see that be a 7-game series, but that would be tough to do without, I think, shortening the regular season at this point. I mean, we're almost going to be at Halloween, and they haven't even started the World Series yet. So I certainly don't think they could add more games, and getting into later in November when you have a lot of Northeast teams that end up in the playoffs, it'd be pretty tough. But it's tough for that round to only be 5 games. I think ultimately you'd like to see 7.
Yeah, and there's been, I think that we heard a little bit more about the idea of a game in hand during the CBA bargaining last year, that maybe you get to the division series and a team like the Dodgers, they have to win 2 out of 4 rather than 3 out of 5, and maybe give them that full advantage of having basically won a game 1. But then you look at it, well, they lost 3 out of 4 anyway to San Diego. Atlanta lost 3 out of 4 anyway to Philadelphia. That even at pretty much as big an advantage as you could give a team in a playoff series still wouldn't have mattered for those 2.
And another interesting point too is now, thinking about it, as far as with the wild card series, obviously it's a 3-game, and I do agree if it would be nice to have it a little more 5 or a 7, but all 3 games are at home. Like the Mets and the Cardinals both had those games at home, and the road team won both series. That's you would think in theory hard to do, and would be a big advantage, for the home team as far as having the whole series there, no travel or anything, your home, your home fans and everything. But just kind of to your point of the randomness, just kind of shows that anything can kind of happen. And that's that is the fun of it. I guess we're just, a little sour grapes as Met fans looking at the run here. But, I think overall it is, it's exciting. It's cool for the National League to have a team like that kind of make a run, but, we'll see what happens there. I guess I want to transition. I don't want to talk about that Atlanta series too much. I know you said it, Mike, but there was a certain manager who I had some gripes with from that series, who happened to be voted manager of the year from the Sporting News. Obviously, that news broke today, but I just wanted to get your thoughts, Tim, overall, just on Bucs season. Obviously, we're talking about a small sample size in the postseason there, whatever, but just overall, just your thoughts and how you think, he'll be set up to maybe continue the success, for next year and the year after, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I actually had a manager of the year vote for the BBWAA, which I literally cannot tell you who I voted for until it's revealed next month. And I thought it was an interesting field in the National League. I voted for this only once before, or the last time I voted for it, it was kind of tough to find three good candidates in my mind. And one of the guys was fired shortly thereafter. And this time I thought there were 5, 6, 7 good candidates in the National League manager of the year, including 3 in the National League East.
Right.
But I think Showalter, he came in and it really helped him, I think, by the juxtaposition of who had been there previously. Not, Luis Rojas, I think, did a reasonable job, but didn't have kind of the built-in gravitas and credibility that Showalter has from 20 plus years as a manager in the major leagues,
right.
and what he had, the track record that he had. And I thought it just kind of, the things he said in spring training seemed to resonate with the players in a way that maybe the previous managers in Rojas and Mickey Callaway hadn't been able to get across. And the main one being just kind of that play better mantra that he established in spring training in a conversation with Francisco Lindor. That idea that, the fans want to like you. Like they don't want to boo you. They want to like you. You play better, they will. And I think we saw, a lot of different players who fans were not necessarily high on in 2021, especially at the end of that season, kind of embrace that and work their way back into the good graces of the fans by having good seasons, Lindor chief among them. And I think, Showalter kind of set that tone, that tone of professionalism, tone of, kind of shutting out the outside noise in a way that it really seemed like it was bothering the 2021 team toward the end of the season. And I think that tone was really important in them getting off to a good start and rolling through, basically 156 games of the season, if not the last weekend.
Yeah, I know, Sal. We've talked about Buck quite a bit on here, and yeah, I mean, mirror everything Britton said about how being down in spring training, it just felt different being around the team. The group of guys felt like they were going to win. They knew they were going to win this year and that they were going to do it playing the right way. And Buck did it. I mean, a complete 180 from what they had in Rojas. Rojas he had no major league experience as a manager, and Buck having all the experience that he had. He said the right things. He did the right things as far as in spring training, and then mostly through the year. I know we've talked about the ins and outs of the in-game managing. I still think there's some stuff left there to be desired. We talked about it before the year with the bullpen. I think there was some spots where Buck still could have went to better guys in positions where they were down 1 or 2 runs. We talked about that, where in September we thought there was games that were winnable and they used guys that were farther down on the depth chart. But I also have to give him credit for the way he used Edwin Díaz too, though. I thought he was really aggressive with how he used Díaz, and I thought he was smart with how he used him too in tie games, or using him for more than 3 outs in a lot of occasions. So I do think he learned some there from what happened in Baltimore. And we'll have to see. I mean, it all comes down to what you have on your roster too. Like we've talked about, Sal, They didn't get anyone besides Givens. So he didn't have a ton of options, particularly for the first couple of weeks after the deadline when like May was hurt and then they had Drew Smith hurt and stuff. So he had less options in the bullpen. But it'll be interesting to see where he goes next year with that bullpen and if it kind of changes in close games that they're losing. But yeah, I mean, overall, it's tough to argue with Buck Showalter getting manager of the year. I mean, they went from 77 wins to 101 wins. Obviously, a lot of that's roster construction, but the Mets are an organization that we didn't have any LOL Mets situations this year. And I think you obviously have to credit part of that to Showalter.
Yeah, I think a manager's job so often is to put out all of the fires around a team, and we've had managers here in the past who were starting some of their own, and so I think Showalter, we didn't have any of that kind of ancillary extracurricular stuff that we're used to seeing with a Mets roster and a Mets team, and that was so nice for them this year to kind of have more of a smooth ship sailing for most of the year. And when you talk about bullpen moves, like I think one of the interesting things I heard late in the season from a couple different relievers was that they felt that they were fresher in September because they didn't chase wins as often in the first 5 months of the season.
Mhm.
I agree with you. There's a certain time that switch has to be made, and a one run deficit in September means you pitch Seth Lugo or Adam Ottavino and not Tyler McGill auditioning for a role in the bullpen. And Showalter was maybe a little bit slower doing that than I expected. But I think when you talk about kind of April through August, one of the reasons that Edwin Díaz was so good all year, Adam Ottavino was so good all year, why those guys were kind of set up to be used more in October had they advanced farther along, was because they're pretty cautious with them over the course of the first 5 months of the year.
Yeah, there's not a lot to say for a manager that wins 100 games. There's not a ton of criticism, right? And Mike, you hit the nail on the head, I think, as far as just the culture change. And obviously in 23, win improvement has a lot to say with that. You have to give them a ton of credit from you both touched on the beginning of the year, especially with so many injuries. They had to basically, they didn't have deGrom till August, basically, and Scherzer they had out for the 8 weeks or whatever it was. And, everyone stepped up and, Buck kind of managed that, obviously, very well. You brought up as far as the bullpen management there. It's just I guess my only thing with him is now it's just, especially that game, that series in Atlanta the week before, it just felt like he was managing a game that was in May as opposed to the playoffs, because that's when, to me, the playoffs started, and he didn't manage like that. And, it's obviously, going through a fine tooth comb there. But, hopefully things like that can improve upon. They can get over the hump, for next season. But you talked about Edwin Díaz in particular. We're going to talk about his, free agents coming up here. Obviously, the Mets have maybe the biggest offseason they've ever had. But I just, from you covering the team all year, I just wanted to have you talk to us a little bit about how dominant and how historically dominant Edwin Díaz was this year.
Yeah, I've had the good fortune to cover some pretty good closers and guys who have had really good seasons. I covered Jonathan Papelbon in Boston and Koji Uehara the year that he struck everyone out with the same splitter, and Craig Kimbrell for a couple seasons in Boston. But Díaz, in terms of kind of the ease of his ninth innings, the consistent ease of them, and just the dominance of his stuff, that he was striking out so many guys that he had like a nice start to the year. And then he just turned it on to another level and never kind of let off that gas. I think basically from that San Francisco game in late May through the rest of the season, he didn't really have a hiccup. And that's pretty remarkable in that role. And especially considering where he came from in 2019, we write players off so quickly in this market. We write them off within a month or two of their first season in New York a lot of times. And he never expressed kind of the public frustration that you see from some players from time to time, that again we saw in 2021 from some Mets during a really tough season for him. And I think that speaks to kind of his inner strength, his mental fortitude, and maybe why he's such a good fit for that role, because you have to be able to move past a failure really quickly and be back there the next day. And it was really cool to see him have that kind of dominant season and to win back a fan base as overwhelmingly as he did, because in 2020 and 2021 when he was pretty damn good, there were still a lot of fans who said, I'll never trust Edwin Díaz in a big game, and then you didn't trust anyone more than him this past season.
Yeah, I mean, you guys did a survey after the season last year, and then did a survey after the season this year, and after last year, I think it was right around 6% of the Mets fan base were like they should extend Edwin Díaz. And then this year, when you did the survey, it was a little over 50% said basically give him the record contract for a reliever. I mean, that's quite a huge leap to go from. And I mean, obviously that's just the fan base, but it comes from what he did on the field. I mean, 2021, he had a pretty good season. Obviously the ERA was a little high, but he was still pretty good. But nothing compared to what he did this year. It's arguably the best season for a reliever in Mets history, with the one Armando Benitez had in 1999. I know Mets fans don't want to hear me compare those two names, but yeah. And it wasn't just that. I mean, I know we've talked about it too, Sal, especially when we're talking about like what a selling point for Díaz's agent this year is the whole narco thing too. I mean, obviously he was great pitching on the mound, but there was also this, I mean, it didn't just capture Mets fans. There was a point this year where it captured baseball, and it was capturing people that weren't normally baseball fans with narco. I mean, that Timmy Trumpet himself wasn't a baseball fan. He had never thrown a baseball before until he got to Citi Field. So just the dominance of the season and what he brings to the team. It's going to be really interesting. I know I've reported that the Mets would obviously like to get him a deal done before he hits free agency. Whether that happens or not, Diaz is still probably going to set the record for a reliever, and rightfully so. I think in this market, I mean, after him, you got a guy, Craig Kimbrell, who lost his spot, is going to be on the market. Kenley Jansen, who pitched well at the end of the year, but I mean, he's not the same Kenley Jansen as he was. I mean, it's not a market that's full of shut down closers. So you have Edwin Díaz just on a whole different level. And he's certainly, I think he's pretty much a shoo-in to get that $100 million contract.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at the rest of the market, like you mentioned, and that makes it even more imperative that the Mets re-sign him. You know, I think there are arguments to be made, you know, and people have made it in the comments on my stories or on Twitter, that, you know, you don't want to invest so much in such a volatile position at closer. You look at Kimbrell and Aroldis Chapman and Jansen and all of them, when they had their 5-year deals, you know, by the end, they didn't seem like they weren't the same pitcher they had been at the start of it. But, you know, the context of where the Mets are, which is with, you know, basically one reliever returning from last year in Drew Smith, and a free agent market that is pretty light on good experienced closers. Most of them are, like you mentioned, kind of veterans on the other side of their prime. And even kind of the setup men you'd think about maybe promoting to a closer role are guys like Adam Ottavino, who's going to be 37 next year. Or, you know, do you want to trust Rafael Montero as a Mets fan after one good season in Houston? So I think all of that points to the Mets probably being as aggressive on Diaz as any of their other free agents.
Yeah, you know, you took my follow-up right out of my head there. I was going to ask exactly that, but I think you nailed it as far as, you know, the reasons why they obviously have to bring him back. And listen, is he going to have, you know, over a 50% K rate for the extent of that contract when they re-sign him? Probably not. Maybe, hopefully, probably not. But whatever you are getting, I think more so seeing the bounce back from what he did in 2019 and you know, 2020. And obviously 2021 was a better year, but still kind of had people had that bad taste in their mouth. For him to kind of basically do this 180 and show, hey, I can pitch in this market and pitch in big games. I think there's a lot to be said to that. And I think, you know, if you're looking to invest in him, any team really, I think that's a major plus, because I think that's someone that, you know, didn't get too down on themselves. They continue to work, and obviously they reap the benefits now. So it's awesome. Hopefully the Mets can bring him back, because like you said, Mike might have to warm up otherwise if they don't, because they'll have one reliever. But Mike, you mentioned that survey that Tim put out at the end of the year, and there was another Mets pitcher on there that seemed to not be as popular. So that I guess that might be a nice transition to one Jacob deGrom. And I know that he did not poll too well this year. So Tim, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. And I guess in general, we can kind of, you know, also talk about deGrom and free agency and kind of what you think things might be going here.
Yeah, I mean, I think in January of this year, we had that was when the first survey came out. It was kind of who's your favorite, you know, one of the questions, who's your favorite current Met? And Jacob deGrom had, I believe it was 72% of the vote. And then at the end of the season, we did say, you know, who was your favorite Met on the 2022 Mets? And deGrom had, I believe, 4% or just below 4%. He finished 7th on the team. There are obviously a couple different factors that go into that. You have the rest of the team is a lot more likable. You know, Jeff McNeil had under 2% in January, and he led the team with like 20 or 21% by the end of the season. That's what winning a batting title does for you. Guys like Lindor and Alonso bounced back. Nimmo had a good full season. You added Marte and Diaz as guys who hold better than deGrom. And there's also that, you know, Jake missed another 4 months. And that plays into kind of the fan perception of him not being a reliable starting pitcher for you. And it leads into a really interesting free agency for him. I think, you know, I'm still operating under the assumption that he's going to opt out. I'd be stunned, quite frankly, if he didn't, because I think there is more money on the open market for him, even after missing so much time. Because you look at just kind of the per start dominance that he shows, and I know there's, you know, he wasn't quite that way at the end of the season. He had the bad start in Oakland. He was kind of mediocre in Atlanta the final weekend of the season. And, you know, he pitched well against San Diego. There's not so many pitchers out there who throw 6 innings of 2-run ball in a postseason game, in a possible elimination game. And you get fans kind of shrugging it off as like, yeah, it wasn't that good, you know? Like his stats were eerily similar to what he had done in Game 5 of the 2015 NLDS, which is held up as his best start ever. And it just felt so different because of the context of who he'd been the last 4 years.
Right.
So I think going into this free agency, and everything I've heard is that the Mets are still interested in bringing Jacob deGrom back. They would like to have him back at the top of the rotation with Max Scherzer. But, you need deGrom to want to come back. And we've heard kind of conflicting things on that. He's always said publicly that he enjoys playing for the Mets, likes the idea of spending his entire career with the team, having been teammates with David Wright, who did that, being pretty close with David Wright. But, you spend this much time with one team, you do start to become, you start thinking about what it could be like elsewhere. And New York, as we've talked about, is a different marketplace than a lot of other places that are easier and more comfortable to play in. I think, it'll be interesting to me if there's a team that guarantees him maybe a 4th year in a contract offer. I can see a lot of teams being willing to go 3 years with him, kind of that Scherzer type deal. His stats are pretty similar to what Scherzer had going into it, even if not having the same platform year. But a 3-year deal around $40 million per season. And then if there's a team willing to go to a 4th year beyond that, and maybe the team that stands out most to me is probably Texas because of the money they spent last year, the changes in their front office, their need for starting pitching. That might be the team that does something kind of like the 2005 Mets did with Pedro Martinez, where you're paying for the pitcher, but you're also paying for a little credibility. It wouldn't surprise me if the Rangers were a team to make a move on like that with deGrom. But you've got Verlander out there, you've got Rodon out there. There are other guys you can make that move for.
Yeah, I mean, Tim basically took exactly what I was going to talk about, the Rangers. They went out and they got the position players last year. They spent a ton of money doing it, and now they need pitching, and they've obviously got a whole new front office. So they want to go out there and make a splash again. And yeah, I mean, there's no bigger splash than Jacob deGrom. And like Tim said, it gives them credibility, and that's still what the Rangers are searching for, because even after signing Seager and Simeon last year, they still had a pretty poor year this year and made some changes, coaching staff and in the front office. So I think deGrom, even where he's at, that's a really good fix for an organization that's looking for credibility. And I do think there will be a team that potentially will go for that 4th year. Obviously, like Tim said too, he didn't have that year going into free agency as Scherzer, but he has age on his size compared to Scherzer. Couple years younger than Scherzer when Scherzer got his deal. So yeah, and the Mets are obviously going to be interested, and I do think deGrom's interested in staying with the Mets too. And I think maybe part of that polling too is just deGrom said some things where Mets fans, I'm not sure if they took it the wrong way, but maybe it wasn't how they wanted Jacob to say it, in saying that he's definitely going to be a Met, or that he had, even after the injury, I'm sure some fans are like, well, now he's definitely not going to opt out because he missed a large portion of the season. So for him to basically, even before he pitched again, be like, no, I'm still opting out. I still think, rightly or wrongly, in fans that I've talked to and on comments and stuff like that, I do think that has at least soured the taste of Mets fans a little bit. But I go back to that playoff game. I mean, he pitched great in that playoff game. That's the first playoff game they've won since 2015, and Jacob deGrom pitched it. And you contrast that with the fact that the other 2 games they lost is essentially because of the starting pitching failed. So you really have to look at how good he finished in that game. And I think, I think he'll end up with around Scherzer money. And if I had to make a prediction, I would predict he goes elsewhere. But the Mets are going to really be starving for starting pitching, and I'm sure that Cohen is going to really want deGrom to stay in New York.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, let me do the math real quick in my head. Like the last 16 seasons, the Mets have won, 9 playoff games, most of them in 2015, and Jacob deGrom has started 4 of them. So, he's the link. It's funny to think about, like, I believe the longest tenured Met who's under team control for next year is Tomas Nido. Which is wild to think about, just how quickly it's turned over. deGrom was the only one from the 2015 team. Nimmo and Lugo were around in 2016, but they're free agents, of course, as well. So it turns over so quickly in this sport that you kind of like the idea of holding on to someone for as long as they could with deGrom, but you also understand that, fans don't like it whenever a player talks about their contract really ever. And Jacob did that at the start of the season, way back in spring training. So,
I don't think he's coming back either. I hope that's just a cynical Met fan in me. I'm fine with Texas. You want to move to Texas, being the AL, that's fine. No harm, no foul there. But I guess my follow-up would be, how nervous should some Mets fans be? And I think people have kind of throughout the season about the Braves making a push for deGrom, because I feel like if that happens, no matter what it is, the Mets could, sign Aaron Judge and bring Babe Ruth back or whatever else. I feel like the fan base is going to be very upset. So I'm just wondering, how much you think of a player you think the Braves will be, come, this offseason here.
I'd be surprised if they really went all in on him, because they've obviously done a ton to extend their core from the position player side largely. They extended Strider at the end of the season. You look at what their rotation looks like going into next year. You've got Strider, you've got Fried. They re-upped Charlie Morton, and I thought that was an interesting move, doing it when they did. You've got Mike Soroka potentially coming back. You've got Kyle Wright. Ian Anderson is still part of that organization after being an integral part of their rotation the last couple of years. So if I'm thinking Atlanta's going to make a big splash, I don't think it's for a starting pitcher necessarily. And they're also, it feels like they've spent most of their money. They can still bump up the payroll a little bit, but I don't think another $40 million for Jacob deGrom is probably in the cards for them. I think if they're making a big splash, it's probably to bring Dansby Swanson back, or a different shortstop. But I think overall, it would, that's why I said Texas as the team, because there's a couple different factors that might motivate them in a way that I don't think Atlanta would be. But every Mets fan can still fear what Atlanta might do, because we've seen guys go there for less money in the past.
Well, and now thinking about Atlanta and just thinking, you're talking about their starting pitching is very good. From a position player standpoint, they're looking good, assuming they bring back Swanson. So the real weak spot there is Jansen becomes a free agent. So Edwin Díaz, not saying, it makes sense that if there was a guy from the Mets, they would make a run at Edwin Díaz.
Right.
Certainly makes sense. He makes sense for the Phillies too. They have Robertson is going to be a free agent too. So that's again why I really think that the Mets should get Diaz done before free agency. It's just once you get him in there, so you have that comfort of knowing you have Diaz in the bullpen, and then you can kind of start working at the rest of the bullpen, because you have Ottavino is a free agent, Lugo is a free agent. Essentially the entire bullpen's a free agent besides Drew Smith. So there's a ton of work there to do, and it would be great for the Mets if they could kind of just cross Diaz off that list super early. And the one guy we haven't talked about very much at all, and obviously is a big free agent, is Brandon Nimmo. The Mets, he was kind of the catalyst. I know Alonso had a big year with home runs and RBIs. Lindor had a great bounce back year. Jeff McNeil won the batting titles. Starling Marte was great out of the two-hole, but Brandon Nimmo was Brandon Nimmo again. He was just really good, and this year he finally stayed healthy for the entire year, for the most part. So he's going to hit free agency, and you got Brandon Nimmo and you got Aaron Judge, and then you have no one in the center field or outfield market really at all. It just drops off a cliff after those two guys. We're talking about Kevin Kiermaier, Mitch Haniger, a couple other names like that. So obviously the Yankees are going to be serious about keeping Judge. So that really makes the Mets, they have to be serious about keeping Nimmo, which I think they are. I think they understand the importance of having him be a leadoff guy and having him in center field. He's just such an integral part of the Mets. And I think you would really kind of have to rework that offense if he does go somewhere else.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting in the kind of the postseason press conference that Billy Epler had, after the postseason. He mentioned kind of, he was talking about the offense, and he really highlighted that they were, I think second in the league in on base percentage. He talked about how they grinded out at bats, and actually counterintuitive, it felt like they grinded out at bats, maybe more so than they did. They were league average in pitches per plate appearance. But Nimmo was tops on the team in that stat. He was in the top 20 in baseball in pitches per plate appearance. And so he kind of sets the tone of that offensive identity that you have the general manager saying he really likes. So that suggests that, the Mets kind of value what he brings to the table, maybe more so than they have at other times in the past. because it took him a while to kind of overcome the fourth outfield label, even within the organization. And so, I'm intrigued by just how aggressive they are with him, because I think it's going to be a price tag that surprises some fans, because there are still some fans who view him the way they did in 2017. This is going to be 9 figures for Brandon Nimmo. It's going to be 5, 6, maybe 7 years for Nimmo. And so it's a pretty significant commitment. It's a commitment knowing he's probably not playing center field at the end of that contract. And there's some other factors that go into, how willing are you to do that? If because of like Michael was saying, that the paucity of options if they don't bring him back, if they don't want Starling Marte to be their everyday center fielder or Mark Cannon to be their everyday center fielder, it's not a lot on the vine there. It's you're talking about Jake Mangum as another guy, another prospect coming up next year, who's probably not, a little bit behind some of the other guys in the system in terms of like Alvarez and Beatty in major league readiness, and Kiermaier in free agency, or trying to make a trade for someone else and giving up prospects to bring in another center fielder. It's kind of like closer in that regard, that there just isn't that great secondary option. So maybe you do overpay for the primary one.
And I think it kind of just pushes to the how important. Obviously, we've all talked about and written about how important this offseason is for the Mets, but I think it's so important that they simply get back to where they were, get close to, at least start by getting close to the roster that they had this year. And that just starts with bringing back some of the free agents. I mean, assuming Bassett becomes a free agent and deGrom and Givens or Carrasco, you're looking at 13 to 14 guys, and all of those guys played at least key roles in key moments for the Mets this year. So we're not talking about small, important guys here. We're talking about pieces that help them win. I mean, even Joely Rodriguez, who's a free agent, he struggled to start the year. Sure, they probably should have gotten a lefty at the deadline, but in September, he was one of the Mets' best relievers down the stretch. And if you look outside of his ERA, his numbers were actually really good this year. He limited hard contact, actually one of the best in baseball at limiting hard contact this year. So that's certainly, I mean, as we know, the depth after Joely Rodriguez isn't good from a left-handed pitching standpoint in the bullpen for the Mets. So, I mean, just a little piece like that, it's important to bring someone, Joely Rodriguez, or someone like Joely Rodriguez in, and then you still should probably have another lefty option that they didn't get last offseason or at the trade deadline. So there's just these little pieces. I mean, Seth Lugo, talk about a guy that's been important for the Mets for a long period of time, and just using in a multiple different roles out of the bullpen in different ways to provide important innings for the Mets. That's a guy that could be gone. And I mean, maybe Seth Lugo finally gets his wish of some team throwing starter money at him. I mean, it's possible. It's something that could happen. And then the Mets are looking to replace 65 quality innings in the bullpen.
Yeah, I mean, I've never covered a team that had this much work to do on their bullpen. You're used to it's 2 or 3 guys, and even some of the guys. You've got some more internal candidates. The Mets don't have a lot of internal candidates here. We talked about Drew Smith. John Curtis will be coming back from Tommy John surgery, a guy they signed in after spring training with the idea that he'd rehab with them and be an option this year. But then, Steven Nagosic is a guy who's been designated for assignment before. Adonis Medina was designated for assignment at the end of the season. So there's just not a lot of inventory coming up through the system where you say, okay, we're losing 6 guys, but we've got 3 that we feel pretty good about being part of our bullpen consistently next season. No, you think they probably have to go out and they probably have to add 6 major league relievers to this roster. And that's a heavy lift. It's really hard to go 2 for 2 in bullpen signings because of the volatility of the position. To go 6 for 6 or even 4 for 6, like that's a tough task. I do not envy anyone trying to pick out, okay, these are the 6 guys who are going to be good at this job in 2023.
Yeah, well, at least one of them is probably going to be Edwin Díaz. That'll be good at least, so that helps one of them. Big one, it's just Mike and I talk so much, over the season, just, as far as this looming, this off season, and now that it's here, I guess it's a good transition. Obviously the Mets have Billy Epler as a general manager, but they are looking for a president of baseball operations. And it looks like a certain one with the Milwaukee Brewers stepped down that the Mets have been chasing the last couple of years in David Stearns. Mike knows I get irked by this now by him the last couple of years because it just feels like they've been fishing along. But I just, with the news, break it today, Tim, I'm just wondering, do you think that this could now, third year, could be a charm that the Mets and David Stearns could finally, form a relationship here? We can get the marriage going. I'm just kind of wondering either way because I'd like to not hear his name every year anymore either way.
I mean, this removes a significant obstacle. You would imagine if David Stearns really wanted to be the Mets, could be team president or president of baseball operations, because Alderson is leaving the team president role. And those are two different things, despite sounding really similar. If he really wanted that job, you would imagine that the Brewers would feel better about giving him the chance to interview and permitting him that and granting him that interview. The Mets would still potentially have to trade something back to Milwaukee. And that's where, Houston's potential interest in Stearns plays a role, that you could have Milwaukee saying, hey, you can interview with both. If both want to hire you, whoever trades us better gets you. I don't think we've ever seen two teams jockeying for the same executive.
Right.
I'm really fortunate to work with Will Salmon, who covered the Brewers for several years before jumping over to New York in the middle of the season. So he knows David reasonably well, and he did some reporting today that there are people around him, and from what Will knows from having covered him, do buy that there is a good chance that this is like he literally wants to sit out the season in terms of just there's some burnout there, that maybe taking a year, kind of taking a step back will better set him up for whatever the next job is when his contract runs out at the end of 2023. And so there is the very real possibility that we go through this entire offseason with Billy Epler in charge. We go through the 2023 season with Billy Epler in charge. And then David Stearns becomes the object of fascination again at the end of next season. At The Athletic, Ken Rosenthal, Britt Giroli, and I reported last November that the Mets had their eye on Stearns and they were going to wait out however long they needed to. That Stearns and Epler have a decent relationship between the two of them. Epler has a 4-year contract. It's not like he'd be forced out at any point. But that the Mets have an eye on potentially making that pair a match in their front office, and they're willing to wait as long as it takes. Maybe we could see something could happen in the next couple of weeks, the next couple of months, this offseason, or it could be a whole other year until we're settled again in the front office.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. The last 2 off seasons, that's been a huge focus of the Mets trying to find. It started with them wanting to find a president of baseball operations. That never really worked out, whether it was Stearns, Billy Beane, Theo Epstein, lots of other guys that they wanted to, just didn't work out. 2 off seasons, and now, the news hits today, and the Astros are going to be in. If Stearns decides that he wants to go and somewhere this year and really be a president of baseball ops, the Astros are certainly going to be interested. Their GM, his contract's up, and that's where in 2015, that's where Stearns was with the Astros. He has a good relationship with the Astros owner. So that there's certainly going to be a team that's interested. And I guess part of me, just as a baseball fan, wants Stearns and wants that to happen, because like Tim said, when's the last time you've ever seen 2 teams vying for a president of baseball ops and having to come up with a trade value for a precedent like that? I don't think it's ever happened before, and I'm not sure it would happen again. But and also, like Tim said, if he does decide to sit the year out, the Mets are going to be there waiting next year. They're going to be in line waiting for him to take the job next year. Again, we'll see what happens. It could play out that he decides to sit this year out. The Astros find their Brian Cashman, if the Yankees don't bring him back, go the Astros, something along those lines. And then next year, the Mets have one fewer obstacle if the Astros fill their need, because like Tim said, that they're willing to sit out for Stearns. They've essentially done it the last 2 years. And with Epler being the GM that Stearns would be overseeing, he's not really pushing them out because him and Epler do have a relationship there. So I think that's something that would work just fine without being contentious or anything like that. It'll be interesting to see. I know certainly no one was expecting what happened today.
Yeah, and one thing we should point out is like you go back a year from now, a year since now, and when the Mets were kind of at the GM meetings, and Sandy Alderson was their temporary general manager, and they were, Zach Scott had just been officially let go, and they seemed like they were being turned down even for interviews by every assistant general manager in baseball. To be where they are now, even with Epler in charge, is a really good development for them. That, I don't think a lot of people would have said 11 and a half months ago that, oh yeah, I feel like the Mets are on the path to winning 101 games next season. I feel like their front office is in a good spot, and I think their front office, even if they are, and we think they are, even as they want to bring someone else in above a Billy Epler, they feel pretty good about what he's been able to do in his first year there, and with good reason.
It really is wild. What a great season. Baseball is so cruel. It's just so cruel. Best season I've probably ever seen as a Mets fan, but that's how it goes. And if it does come down to a trade, listen, give him Darren Ruff. We'll call it even. We'll bring David over. Not a big deal, right? We'll draw up the contract. It's fine. Everybody wins, right? Oh, but we don't want to keep you here all night. So real quick, Tim, I do just want to get your World Series prediction really quick. Who you think's going to win between the Astros and the Phillies, and Astros, right? Astros.
Well, I put we've been doing our picks at The Athletic all postseason, and I enter the World Series really crushing it. I'm 2-8 in my postseason series picks. The only two that I've gotten right are Astros over Mariners and Astros over Yankees, and so obviously the next logical step is Phillies at 6, because who knows? I think like the Astros are, I think, pretty clearly the better team.
Yep.
They do. Their pitching staff not only is really good to begin with, but they suppress home runs,
right.
Which is how the Phillies kind of live as an offense. So you would think that Houston has, if I'm picking objectively, I'm saying Houston. Like I think everyone who picks objectively would say Houston. But the way this has gone, sure, Philadelphia.
Yeah, I mean, the Astros are clearly the better team. I kind of like to see Zach Wheeler get a ring. That would be kind of cool. And from just like a Mets fan standpoint, I know there was like a lot of discussion like, oh, we can't root for the Phillies, but it's the Astros, the cheating scandal, that sort of thing. So, I mean, we ran a poll at MMO, and it was, do you want to see the Phillies win, the Astros win, or an asteroid destroy the Earth? And I don't think anyone's shocked to find out that Mets fans decided Astros would win, but second place was the asteroid. So pretty clear that they don't want to see Noah Syndergaard get a ring. I think the Astros, I'll take the Astros in 5. I mean, Verlander starting off the series, I just think they're just too much better than the Phillies.
Yeah, no, I have Astros in 5 too. They're just really good. I don't care about the cheating stuff anymore. They won 2 games on the road in 17 to win the World Series. They've been great ever since. Just a well-run organization. Good for them, and we'll see what happens. But hopefully be a good World Series, entertaining at least, right? That's what you can kind of hope for. And real quick, Mike, I think one last thing you had as far as just with Ronnie Mauricio. Want to give us a little update and winter ball there, and then we'll call put a bow on this bad boy.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Mets season's over, and their league of prospects in the Arizona Fall League it's a couple of guys in the back end of the top 30. So it's not the typical where you have a top prospect. So really the Mets fans' eyes have been on Ronnie Mauricio in the Dominican Winter League, and he's been great. I mean, going into last night, he led the league in OPS, a little over 1,100 before he went 0 for 4 last night. I guess he's human. He had a 2-walk game, which is rare for him, and he's 5 for 5 in steals, which again is something that he hasn't been prolific in either. So, and showing power, home run, and then inside the park home run the next night. It's because Mauricio is a really curious case, because he's one of the names that was thrown around at the trade deadline of this is a guy that they certainly need to put out there to try to get a Contreras or another bat like that. So it's a very curious offseason for Mauricio, because as we've talked about, the Mets have a lot of needs this offseason, and it's almost impossible for them to just simply sign all of these guys back. So they're likely going to have to make a trade for probably like a starting pitcher or a reliever or two. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with Mauricio. And if he does stay, I mean, he's at this point in his career where he's ready for AAA. So is this the time that they finally move him from shortstop? Because we all know what the Mets are doing at shortstop for the next 9 years. So it'll be interesting to see where he ends up going from that a position standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, he's in a fascinating spot. Like, they are with all of their prospects, really. It's so hard to integrate young players in a market like New York when you're in a win now mode. There's a world where they can go into next year and say, okay, Francisco Alvarez is going to catch at least half the time. Brett Beatty's going to be playing third base most of the time. Mark Vientos will be our DH most of the time. And that could be the solution to their power issues. It could also go horribly wrong. And so it'll be really interesting to see what they decide to do with each of those guys individually. And then Mauricio coming in behind, is he the opening day shortstop in Syracuse? Do they move him to third because you've got Beatty there? They move him to second on the other side of the bag. Do they try him out in the outfield at all? Because that's a spot where they don't have a ton of depth going forward. A lot of different options and a lot of intriguing ones for them.
Yeah, no. So everything's interesting from the prospects up to the major league roster for everything that they have to do. It's going to be a really interesting offseason. Tim, we're going to be following you along for everything with it. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Everybody, we'll catch you after the World Series, and we'll keep you updated on everything that's going on. With the Mets' crazy offseason. But until then, let's go Mets.